Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Nancy Charlie. I'm the archivist here, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Amy Matthewson, sorry. She received her doctorate from the SOAS in 2019 from the Department of History, and she's currently a lecturer in history for the University of Iceland. Her research interests include visual and material cultures and race relations, and in particular, Sino-British relations in the late 19th and early 20th century. Hence the book. Cartoon in China, Punch, Power and Politics in the Victorian Era is Amy's first monograph. It explores the series of cartoons of China and the Chinese that were published in popular British culture in the satirical magazine Punch over a 60-year period from 1841 to 1901. This evening, she's going to give an overview of the book, looking at the editors, writers and artists at Punch, as well as the political climate in which the cartoons arose. I first met Amy when she actually came and volunteered here and catalogued some slides of China that we have, some old glass slides. And since then, she's been a regular person here and in my life. So I'm very happy to welcome her. I'm a teacher. Thank
you very much. Thank you, Nancy. So I'd like to first take the time to say thank you for coming, especially those on Zoom as well. I know that there's people coming from different time zones. I'd also like to thank the Royal Asiatic Society, in particular, Alison, Nancy, and Matty for organizing and help support this talk. So let's get started. I would like to begin at the beginning. And at the beginning of my research always begins with this particular image. I first encountered the popular British satirical magazine Punch years ago while I was doing my master's at the University of Victoria in Canada. And I remember sitting on the library floor, flipping through the magazines, and I encountered this image. Published on the 4th of July, 1900, Punch artist Edward Linley Sanborn created a Chinese Humpty Dumpty on the cusp of a great fall. And the image instantly captivated me. The caricature depicts exaggerated features to denote racial difference. The style of clothing and hair braided into a queue highlights foreignness, and the archaic sword and animalistic hands represent barbarity. At the time, I did not immediately situate this cartoon within its historical context and was simply fascinated with the image itself. But looking at the date, 1900, I realized that I was looking at a Chinese Humpty Dumpty just about to take his tumble at a time when British and China were engaged in armed conflict during the Boxer Uprising. The perspective is from a British soldier, perhaps one of the ones holding a bayonet in the foreground. And what I found witty with this visual narrative is that it clearly conveyed the idea that China did not stand a chance against Britain. The cartoon laughs away the feasibility of a victorious China, for as the nursery rhyme tells us, when Humpty Dumpty tumbles off of the Great Wall, all the emperor's horses and all the emperor's men will not be able to put Humpty together again. And from this cartoon, my interest expanded. I was curious to know more about the ideology of this magazine, as well as the staff members who created it. And I also wondered what the series of images were of China during the late 19th century, a time when Sino-British relations was tumultuous. Were there changes in representation? And if so, what were the differences and at what exact point of contact did these changes occur? My research explores how Punch used China as a site upon which wider anxieties of Britain's social stratification, as well as its global position as an imperial power, were both shaped and negotiated. As perceptions of China changed, So too did the visual and textual discourses circulating in Britain society, including those transmitted into satirical form in the pages of Punch. These cartoons offer a complex understanding of the various and at times contradictory forms of China within the British imaginaries, which in turn reveal British self-perception on its own society, as well as its role in the world at large. As a historical source, Punch is unique due to its widespread popularity and influence. Scholars often refer to the magazine as a national institution in the Victorian era, and its circulation numbers, global influence, and longevity mark Punch as one of the most successful magazines in the English-speaking world, from its inaugural issue in 1841 until its last publication in 2002. The magazine was quoted in the Times as well as the House of Commons and was read by notable figures such as Charlotte Bronte, Robert Browning, Henry James, Queen Victoria, and Prince Albert. There is also a testament of Punch readers extending beyond the middle and upper classes. For example, in Wales, when the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, was addressed by a mail carrier, the surprised politician asked how he knew him, and the postman replied, "Seen your picture in the Punch, my lord." Thomas Carlyle often complained that when he visited Scotland, people pestered him with questions as to who it was that wrote this or that in Punch. And the circulation of the magazine also extended beyond Britain. In 1883, Henry James wrote, and I quote, "Many people in the United States gathered their knowledge of English life almost entirely from Punch," to which he added, "And it would be difficult to imagine a more abundant and on the whole more accurate informant." In France and Germany, the magazine experienced on and off bans with varying degrees of censorship. In Germany, for example, Kaiser Wilhelm II withdrew his subscription to the magazine, as well as those of members of the royal family, when he took offense to Punch's rendition of his struggle between him and the Reichstag. As a response, Sanborn illustrated this image here, showing the Kaiser angrily ripping up Punch magazine as he stands among his things, scattered and thrown around as a result of his temper tantrum. The beginning of Punch as a magazine had an initial bumpy start, but things settled, and in the first 10 years of the magazine, there were few departures and staff changes, shaping the men behind the magazine into a very tight-knit community that remained predominantly unchanged. So before looking at the cartoons of China and the Chinese, I want to discuss the editors and some key writers and artists, essentially the men that made up the magazine, in order to understand the policies and ideology of Punch during the late 19th century, as it was these men who gathered together every week to decide what to write and how to illustrate, as well as how to convey a very clear message. From the founding of the magazine in 1841 until 1901, the end of our period of interest, there were only 4 editors. Mark Lemon until his death in 1870. This was followed by Shirley Brooks in 1874, Tom Taylor in 1880, and then finally Sir Francis Burnand, who was editor until 1906. And each of these editors stamped his personality as well as his political leanings onto the general tone of the magazine, which made a significant difference in the direction and political complexion of Punch. Lemon, as you see here, was essential in establishing the magazine's success due to his vigilance in ensuring that the content stayed away from scurrility and coincided with Victorian notions and ideas of gentility and respectability. While Lemon became known for his wit, sense of humor, and friendly personality, he was also appreciated for his diplomacy in handling even the most dominating personalities, as well as for his intuition on what they say public feeling. His understanding of what should and should not appear in the magazine was invaluable. If in doubt, Lemon exercised caution in taking a stance, preferring to wait and see which direction public opinion would sway. When Lemon died in 1870, Shirley Brooks took over the role of editor, and with Brooks, Punch took a more kind of establishmentarian outlook, as Brooks was an outspoken Tory. Patrick Leary, in his book, The Punch Brotherhood, describes Brooks as follows, and I quote, "He distrusted most members of the working class on principle. He applauded the imperialistic gusto of Palmerston, a true gentleman, disapproved of Catholics, especially Irish ones, was outraged by the disestablishment of the Irish Church in 1869, although utterly without religious feeling himself. He felt a suspicion of Jews and thought the dark races irremediably inferior." Brooks was only an editor for 4 short years, his position coming to an end with his death in 1874, to which this post was then taken up by Tom Taylor. Taylor was very well liked as a person and appreciated for always encouraging and helping others. However, his humor was considered too academic in nature. Outside his Punch duties, Taylor's impressive career included posts as professor of English literature, secretary to the Board of Health. He was a barrister, the author of over 70 plays. He was a passionate art critic and an active member of the Wandsworth Liberal Club. And although a liberal in politics, he regarded the suffrage movement with deep suspicion. Francis Burnand, he took over as editor when Taylor died in 1880, and the last editor that we will be looking at, as he remained editor until the end of my period of interest. Burnand successfully reestablished Punch's reputation as a fun and jovial magazine. He claimed to have no political sympathies or antipathies whatsoever, and this apparent political neutrality changed Punch's tone, as the magazine is to have reflected, and I quote, "tolerance, political and religious, and wider sympathy than had lately been the case." Perhaps it was Burnand's conversion to Catholicism in 1858, much to his father's horror, that enabled him to be tolerant of differing religious convictions, and this in turn influenced the tone of the magazine. But how accurate were claims of Burnand's political neutrality? While he may have instilled more religious tolerance, the magazine he presided over had notable nationalistic sentiments. The art critic Marion Spielman, who arguably wrote the most comprehensive history of Punch, reports that Burnand was, and I quote, "born in 1837, having been too gallant to come into the world before his queen had ascended the throne, and too loyal to delay his appearance after she had taken her place." Burnand's loyalty is recorded in his own diary when he registered his affront at the satirical magazine The Tomahawk, when they illustrated an empty chair depicting a vacant throne, a comment on the absent Queen Victoria as she mourned over the death of Prince Albert. Burnand denounced the cartoon as, and I quote, "an unprovoked attack and conceived in the worst possible taste," stating that Victoria had not yet felt herself equal to appearing once again among her people and brightening London with her gracious presence. His loyalty to Queen must have extended to country, as there were more politically charged cartoons of China during Burnand's editorship than at any earlier period in Punch magazine. Now, let's move on to some of the writers and artists. The writings of Punch were a combination of members of staff as well as anonymous contributions. As a popular publication, Punch inevitably attracted a host of hopefuls that varied in quality. Spielman commented that the caliber of the jokes that the magazine received, and I quote, "is sufficient to prove how deficient in wit, if not in humor, is the English people considered as a community." Fortunately, Punch had writers as staff members and was therefore not completely reliant on contributions from the public. In 1866, when Lemon declared, "We have never had a serious dispute," he deliberately ignored a number of conflicts in the early years. Henry Silver, an early staff member, recorded in his diary that the early years were endless squabbles due to every writer finding fault with every article inserted in preference to his own. Even the title of the magazine was objected to when the name of the magazine was announced. "Well, boys, the title for the new work is to be Punch." And this declaration was met with complaints that it was, I quote, "a very stupid one." In the early days, it was this man here, Douglas Gerald, who dominated the tone of the magazine with his radical politics. Gerald took the opportunity to use Punch as a platform to express his opinions on subjects he felt strongly, such as the hypocrisy of the privileged class and the suffering of the poor. Nicknamed the Little Wasp because of his stinging attacks and sharp sense of humor, Gerald's strong opinions, impatience, and intolerance frequently clashed with some of the other members. William Thackeray was Gerald's strongest opponent. While sympathetic to radical politics in his youth, Thackeray became increasingly conservative as he got older and more successful, and had little patience for Gerald's contempt for authority. Gerald, for his part, considered Thackeray a snob. The men once sat next to one another at the weekly dinners, but as Spielman says, there was little love as space between them. And after his worldwide success with Vanity Fair, Thackeray resigned, although he continued to maintain contact with the Punch men and occasionally joined them for the weekly dinner. It was these weekly Wednesday dinners that eventually became famous, in which all the members of staff would gather to talk about the hot topics of the day and decide what to write and what to illustrate for Punch magazine. By the time Brooks became editor, there were no writers left that had the energy or intellectual capacity to challenge him, and thus, under his influence, the politics of Punch shifted. As early as the end of the 1840s, Gerald's radicalism was tempered within the pages of the magazine. Writing to his good friend Charles Dickens, Gerald complained at the changing politics of the magazine. I quote, "I do not very cordially agree with Punch's new spirit. I am convinced that the world will get tired, at least I hope so, of this eternal guffaw of all things. After all, life has something serious in it. It cannot be all a comic history of humanity." But shift the magazine did, much to the dismay of Gerald. And this shift was reflected in the style of cartooning by the artists that worked at Punch. In 1862, Sir John Tenniel became the chief political artist and the most prolific artist at Punch for nearly 40 years. Tenniel, and you might know him from his very charming Alice in Wonderland illustrations, became the first artist knighted for his work done mostly in black and white. Much like some of his colleagues at Punch, Tenniel claimed to care little for politics. He said, as for political opinions, I have none. At least if I have my own little politics, I keep them to myself and profess only those of my paper." This lack of interest in politics is repeated by many of the Punch men. I think quite an odd assertion for those creating weekly political commentaries. And contrary to his statement of political neutrality, Tenniel's most powerful cartoons dealt directly with politics. For example, his 1857, The British Lion's Vengeance on the Bengal Tiger, is said to have effectively captured the nation's indignation over the rebellion of Indian troops and the subsequent massacre. A few months later, the Illustrated London News declared that, and I quote, "Mr. Tenniel's reputation stands too high to need eulogy, and the noble engraving which he supplied to Punch a few months ago, depicting the British Lion's vengeance, is in every household. Before Tenniel was chief cartoonist, that position was occupied by one of Thackeray's longtime friends and allies at Punch, the artist John Leech, who was said to be a handsome and quiet individual who shared Thackeray's dislike of Gerald. But while Gerald's powerful writing skills set the tone of the magazine, it was Leech who first defined the look of the magazine with his highly popular illustrations. Thackeray once compared the two men, stating that Gerald, and I quote, looked up at the rich and great with a fierce, a sarcastic aspect and a threatening posture, while Leech surveys society from a gentleman's point of view. Fellow artist George du Maurier went further in describing Leech, and he stated, Leech was John Bull himself, but John Bull refined and civilized. John Bull polite, modest, gentle, full of self-respect and self-restraint, and with all the bully softened out of him. Manly first and gentlemanly after, but very soon after. More at home, perhaps, in the club, the drawing room, and the hunting field, in Piccadilly and the park, than in the farm or shop or marketplace. A normal Englishman of the upper middle class. Although Leech has been said, like others, to show no interest in politics and cared not to engage with political debates and conversation, he was a Tory who is said to have openly sneered at the working man. He also openly despised foreigners, so much so that when du Maurier was introduced to Leech for the first time, he was anxious that he would not be mistaken as a foreigner on account of his last name. And as recorded in du Maurier's diary, he went out of his way to assure Leech that he was rather more English than John Bull himself. So who was George du Maurier? He was born in Paris, and he studied for a scientific career in chemistry, for which he was called, I quote, shockingly bad. He was, however, a very talented artist, but had little hopes for success as he was blind in one eye from a laboratory accident. Over time, however, du Maurier became known and appreciated for his illustrations mocking society, manners, and etiquette. Henry James noted that although du Maurier was a great lover and illustrator of beauty, he also had, and I quote, an artistic aesthetic need to make ugly people as ugly as they are. And he finds a real entertainment in the completeness, in the perfection of certain forms of facial queerness. What was strange to du Maurier was depicted as kind of grotesque or fantastical figures. He had a peculiar perception of the look of breeding and of race, and was especially fond of ridiculing the awkward or the out of place. So these were some of the writers and artists that staffed the magazine at a time of British global expansion. With Britain's close and continual encounters with faraway nations and peoples, Punch provided readers with a sense of familiarity. The jabs at the disorderly lower classes or the superficiality of the middle classes offered comic pleasures at a tumultuous time of rapid changes. Anxieties could be dispelled by laughing away social foibles, especially if the targets were obviously and entertainingly out of place. And who better than the foreigner with differences in physiognomy and mannerisms? So, what was the changing nature of the magazine's attitude towards China in the late 19th century? Punch's attitude towards China in the early 1840s was a combination of playfulness mixed with a sense of superiority. The real target of attack in the early days was Britain. It was British social and political ills, and Gerald's distinctive venomous style of expressing his disapproval was felt within the general tone of the magazine. Punch's initial radicalism in its early years tended to use China and the Chinese simply as a tool to make pointed social and political criticisms on British issues. A good example is found in Exhibition of the English in China, in which Punch created a satirical exhibition by a fictitious Chinese man who had traveled many years to get to England. The collection features the faces and fashions of the barbarian English with an accompanying catalogue of our good and bad qualities. Displays include an exhausted and overworked needlewoman crying into her work, as well as a greedy and cunning shopkeeper, represented as a fox rubbing his hands together. In the 18th century, Montesquieu's Persian Letters, as well as Oliver Goldsmith's The Citizen of the World, used fictitious Oriental observers to challenge claims of universal truth and to highlight a nation's political and social foibles. And while it is the satirist's own nation that is the obvious subject of attack, the ideological use of, and again, I put it in quotations, Orientals, maintained stereotypes and underscored difference through racial physiognomy as well as supposed manners and customs. So Punch used China as this kind of traditional way of using an observer, an already familiar satirical tool to lampoon a variety of domestic issues and raise disconcerting questions about the state of British society. Who, Punch asks its readers, are the real barbarians, and what ethical values equate to a nation that can claim to be civilized? Certainly in the early days, Punch's approach to China was playful as well as condescending. Britain had just defeated China in the First Opium War, and while Punch was proud of Britain's victory, it was also sympathetic to China. The illustrations, in keeping with caricature as a style, highlighted the foreignness of the Chinese by exaggerating physiognomy, but most of the commentary was poking fun at the British. During the Great Exhibition of 1851, for example, Punch took the opportunity to poke fun at every other that was paying London a visit, and this included the English working class. John Leech's Dinner Time at the Crystal Palace captures the working class standing and sitting around a Shakespeare statue that was displayed at the Great Exhibition. One woman with a picnic lunch speaks to another who sits with breast exposed as she nurses her baby. A man stands to the side as he pours some kind of spirit into a wine glass, while the woman next to him slumps against the plinth, either from too much drink or perhaps from sheer exhaustion. Unlike the working class, however, the Chinese were by comparison so very other in their physiognomy, fashion, and taste, and became part of Punch's repertoire of the foreign spectacle in which the imagined reader would not relate or be able to identify with. But what happens when these systems of classification are suddenly disrupted? The appearance of He Sing, a Chinese man mistaken for a Mandarin at the opening ceremonies of the Crystal Palace on the 30th of April, 1851, unsettled rigid class markers. Dressed in embroidered silk, nobody knew who he was, but the sight of him greeting the Duke of Wellington led people to believe that he was a Chinese Mandarin. During the singing of the Hallelujah chorus, He Sing suddenly, and to everyone's amusement, jostled his way to the front of the throne and began bowing repeatedly to Queen Victoria. As his identity remains unknown, he was then invited to form part of the procession and was included in the official watercolor that commemorated the event, which is what you see before you. I don't know if you can see He Sing right at the front there. So it wasn't until the ceremonies were over that it became known that He Sing was actually not a Mandarin at all, but he was a resident on a Chinese junk moored in the Thames there as a curiosity, and he was only trying to drum up business by attending the Great Exhibition. William Thackeray recorded the event by commenting, and I quote, "There was a Chinese with a face like a pantomime mask who went up and kissed the Duke of Wellington, much to the old boy's surprise." What annoyed the staff at Punch was not that a Chinese man was at the opening ceremonies, but that he was mistaken for a Mandarin, thereby disrupting established social boundaries. During Punch's reporting of the Great Exhibition, China was simply one of many satirical victims waiting for the cartoonist to poke fun at. This would change, however, with the end of the Second Opium War, when, in the words of Martha Banta, Punch's initial playful seriousness became serious playfulness. The China question became a contentious issue and captured the interest of the public. The Daily News declared that, and I quote, "Debates on the Canton hostilities have produced a profound impression on the English mind. The moral sense of the country is aroused. The common sense of the country is up in arms." In Parliament, Richard Cobden led a long debate with the opposition led by Lord Palmerston, who believed that issues in China were best solved through military action, and Palmerston hit upon a magic ingredient in appealing to the emotions of the British public through nationalist sentiments in order to garner support. Palmerston was skilled at manipulating the press, offering journalists and newspaper editors privileged information, access to people, as well as financial bribes in order to secure support at home over his foreign policies. His opponents understood the power in managing the press, as well as the interconnection between the press and the public is strong. However, they also realized Palmerston's uncontested mastery in this arena. Cobden wondered, I quote, "How many public men who have ambitions to gratify will range themselves alongside of us so long as the press is thus opposed? To change the press, we must change public opinion. And mind, when I speak of the press, I speak of those weekly papers that are really supported by the people." Punch coincided with the majority of London newspapers that adopted an aggressive stance against China. Only more radical papers argued that what they called Palmerston mania was sheer stupidity. Others, such as the Times, experienced a change and a shift in their perspective. The Times was initially hostile towards Palmerston, but this changed in 1855 after John Delane became editor and thought it might be detrimental to the newspaper to be excluded from newsworthy sources. He thus decided to support Palmerston, and he decided to support Palmerston on his policy upon which the country as a whole was all agreed. So Leech's cartoons, A Lesson to John Chinaman, depicts Mr. Punch standing alongside Palmerston's, holding a cat o' nine tails about to bring down upon a Chinese man. "Give it him well, Pam, while you are about it," says Mr. Punch with approval. In another half-page cartoon, Palmerston points towards a group of kidnapping, murdering, poisoning Chinese, with one man about to throw a baby off of a cliff. And in the background, buildings are ablaze in a scene of total chaos, and Cobden is depicted looking horrified while clutching his Buddha. In Parliament, Palmerston attacked Cobden, saying he had anti-English feelings and argued that a motion of censure meant that Britain had abandoned, and I quote, "a large community of British subjects at the extreme end of the globe to a set of barbarians, a set of kidnapping, murdering, poisoning barbarians." And his tactic proved successful. Palmerston won a majority, and with Palmerston's majority government, Britain went to war with China. After a series of naval skirmishes, Britain and France forces, they seized Guangzhou, and they started north to secure ratification of the Treaty of Tianjin. The Qing court sued for peace, but to complicate matters, a group of British envoys under a flag of truce were captured during the conflict, ill-treated, and this resulted in the death of half of the entourage. Punch voiced its outrage with John Tenniel's cartoon entitled "What We Ought to Do in China." And the cartoon depicts a British warrior on horseback with ball and chain in hand. He takes aim at a Chinese dragon, which cowers and slinks away. And the violent whipping that Punch earlier advocated was realized, for in October 1860, a punitive mission was carried out in which a beautiful complex of palaces called the Yuan, known in English as the Summer Palace, was looted and burned to the ground. During the 1870s and 1880s, Punch was relatively quiet on the China front, but picked up again with gusto in 1894 at the outbreak of the First Sino-Japanese War. This was a short but decisive war in which China and Japan went to war over control of Korea. It captured the attention of the world, with many shocked at Japan's quick victory over a humiliated China. John Tenniel's A Touching Appeal depicts an overgrown, childlike Chinese man named Youngie Bong Buhu, who starts a fight but then loses to a much smaller Japanese man. The Japanese figure stands strong and ready for action. Both hands are clenched into fists, and he leans threateningly towards the defeated Youngie Bong Buhu, who sits on the ground, his nose red as a result from the fight. The accompanying poem explains the cartoon. The proud Youngie Bong Buhu was jealous of Japan, who, although small, was, and I quote, plucky. He was a plucky chappy and made big Youngie Buhu feel unhappy. This cartoon and accompanying poem was published in November 1894, when it was obvious that China was losing the war, and Western powers were simply astounded by China's rapid defeat and theorized that this was a result of China's extensive corruption, stubborn resistance to Western technology, and the nation's backwardness. Japan emerged as a new imperial player on the international arena, and A Touching Appeal reflected this shift in power. The message in the cartoon declared that China may be great in size, but it is clear that it is not great in strength. Japan, on the other hand, is represented in relatable terms. Not only is it an island nation like Britain, but also the Japanese are characterized as people with plucky spirits, a trait easily identifiable as it is found in the emblematic John Bull, who embodies independence and courage. This accompanying poem is equally significant, as it is within this textual representation that China and Japan are categorized and understood within the British popular imagination. Youngie Bong Buhu speaks in broken pidgin English, and his rival, the Japanese man, communicates in standard grammatically correct English. I don't know if you can quickly skim the text. So A Touching Appeal is notable in focusing the linguistic humor solely on the Chinese figure. Tenniel's Japanese figure with command of the English language signified full cultural competence and social prestige, and indicated that Japan was able to enter the civilized world. The Chinese, on the other hand, were not able to successfully integrate themselves into the modern world and were thus represented as inferior speakers. However, the admiration of Japan as a plucky nation entering the international arena as a formidable power quickly dissipated into anxieties over British interest in China. With Britain's heightened geopolitical awareness and consciousness in its global political and economic position, Punch used his cartoons as a powerful tool to justify Britain's presence in China, as well as convince its readers of nations they should regard with suspicion. In particular, Russia. Russia's interest in Manchuria and other outer provinces, as well as its close proximity to China, positioned Russia as an immediate threat to Britain. Representations of Russia as a marauding bear dominated Punch cartoons and reflected mistrust and imperial competition. So this is John Tenniel's Sentinels, and you can see how the British lion and the Russian bear are regarding each other with suspicion. And this cartoon here, that's entitled The Fight for the Footplate, depicts the power struggle between Britain and Russia over territory, as well as control over infrastructure, while simultaneously portraying China's inability or unwillingness to defend itself. The text to this image, which you can't see, has the British saying, "It's my engine and I'm going to drive it." And the Russian responds, "No, it ought to be mine. And if it weren't for my love of peace, you'd see what I'd do." The Chinese man in broken English simply says, all right, I really don't care." By the closing years of the 19th century, strong anti-foreign, anti-Christian sentiments permeated through China's social fabric. And this was further aggravated by economic impoverishment, natural calamities, and growing Chinese nationalism. And this combination provided the foundation for a violent demonstration known as the Boxer Uprising against Chinese and foreign Christians, as well as the foreign community in China. As a response, an international military coalition was formed, the 8 nations being Britain, Japan, Russia, France, America, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. They were called the 8-Nation Alliance, and they numbered roughly 20,000 personnel, half of whom were Japanese troops. And navigating international rivalries amidst deep distrust while simultaneously joining forces for a common cause was complex and precarious. Tu Peking captures this tension. The Japanese figure, quite eager, says "en avant," and he cries to the Russian soldier who is looking less enthusiastic. And the caption to this has the Russian man saying, "Oh dear, I do hope his motives are as disinterested as mine." So while the Boxers came to exemplify China as a barbaric and primitive country waiting, indeed needing to be redeemed by Christianity, Punch focused its attention primarily on the continued distrust and trepidation between rival powers, thereby only using China as a site where imperial anxieties were being played out. So I'd like to conclude with this illustration here. It's found in Punch Almanac for 1901, where Sir Bernard Partridge depicts the nations of the world gambling. At the front of the image, a despondent-looking Chinese man is playing a game of roulette with Father Time. The wheel, labeled 20th century, is next to the sands of time. And the Chinese man lost in thought as he sits among the world but is disengaged from the other players. Father Time is the only figure that takes an interest. He's dealing out China's fate for the 20th century. Is the cartoon's message telling us that it is only a matter of time before China loses the game of imperialism? Of course, we all have the benefit from hindsight, and we know what happened in the 20th century. But for the men at Punch at that time, only time would tell how things would play out. And throughout the late 19th century, Punch's visual and textual satire played an important part in constructing a very fixed idea of China and the Chinese in the British popular imagination. And the series coincided and reinforced a homogenized narrative, thereby translating Punch's discourse from entertainment into something much more serious. That concludes my talk.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Has anyone got any questions they'd like to share? Ed.
Thank you for your question, Ed. They didn't differentiate between the Manchus and the Han, for example, but same with Britain and England and Wales and Scotland were just kind of all lumped together as well. So there was no division or differentiation in that way.
Which I should have focused on earlier is role of the mission. Is there any they come. I know they would have also come to Joseph.
Punch was actually very, they weren't keen on missionaries. And I think that they were, if they did appear in the text, it was always to be made fun of. They weren't, they weren't keen on missionary activity. Especially in the early years, I think Gerald specifically thought that the money should remain in Britain in order to fix a lot of the social ills rather than going off into to different places. Thank you, Lauren.
The magazine.
There was a lot of, we could see the popularity of the cartoons by sale numbers. So the British Lion and the Bengal Tiger, that's quoted a lot in different newspapers. The sales went up as well. So, but in terms of very specific, there's some people who will make a note in a diary, but yes, it's scattered. It's kind of scattered and fragmented. But thank you. That's a great question. Yes.
There's a question about the difference between the Chinese and cultural and physical. So why were they? I mean, I've come across references, standard works on international law from the 1870s and 80s. Just state as a matter of course that international law applies to the Western countries and Japan. So it seems as if quite a strong distinction made a bit earlier. Now, I'm just asking really, do you think there are deeper roots? Or actually, do you think it's a response to the Meiji Restoration? The Japanese have been consciously Western, so that Chinese haven't. So that would suggest really the sort of the racial prejudice against the Chinese. The way is sort of superficial. You see that?
I do. Thank you. That's a great question. So Commodore Perry, when he arrived in Japan, Punch had a picture of what looked like a African figure because they weren't sure how to caricaturize Japanese people. And so he's standing on this figure is standing on a piece of land, and underneath it, it says very clearly Japan, so that readers would know that that's who they are referring to. So that's the first reference of Japan that I was able to find in Punch. And then there was the cult of Japan that happened in the 1870s and 1880s with the new aesthetic movement that coincided with kind of China mania as well. But after the first Sino-Japanese War, they started to appear in Punch in the large cuts frequently, and it was always as an ally of Britain. But I think you touched upon an important point in terms of they were respected in terms of technological terms and the ability to kind of modernize themselves along Western lines, where China, they thought, well, China had more time to modernize. Why didn't they? How did they get defeated so quickly? Everybody thought it would be a rapid defeat for Japan, and it didn't end up being that way. So they lost a lot of respect and prestige. Great questions, Jessica. Thank you. So to answer the first one, there was a punch Shanghai, a Shanghai punch. It didn't last very long, but there was a Shanghai punch. In terms of the British punch making its way to China, that I don't know. I know George Orwell in Burmese Days cites Punch magazine being on the table in the officers' room, so it did find its way. China specifically, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't come across anything. And in terms of your second question, yes, there was representations of women, but very rarely. So Cixi was represented when the Guangxu Emperor wanted to do these reforms, and it was put to a halt because of Cixi. So she's just depicted grabbing his ear like a mother reprimanding his naughty child. So there is that representation. And there's also one image of China being depicted as a Chinese woman, which that's the only image that I've seen. And Japan is kind of nestling up to a female China on a park bench with the Russian bear behind looking rather annoyed. But that's the only, usually China is represented as a man, a stereotypical man with a queue or a dragon.
Anyone else? I don't know if we find out if there's any on Zoom. I don't know how to do that.
Oh, I think, can we click here?
Ah, any chat.
I think.
Just checking whether there's any Zoom questions. Yeah.
Yes, that's all I know, but I can't see if there's any other.
Whether there's any chats. It seemed to be. Ah, about more. Oh, it'll disappear again. Oh, chat one. Let's see if it. Okay, we have a question from James Helcrow that says, "Hi Amy, thanks for the great talk. How did Punch depict opium and the opium trade and Britain's role in it, if at all?"
The first Opium War. Thank you, James. The first Opium War, Punch was very sympathetic to China. Not so much by the end of the Second Opium War, and especially after the British envoys were captured and ill-treated. So the whole tone and attitude of Punch changed. But certainly in the first Opium War, Punch was very sympathetic to China and did not necessarily agree with the opium trade, although they were also quite pleased that Britain won the war. So there was a kind of a tension between being pleased at the victory that Britain had, but also in disagreement with the opium as a trade.
I think that's it. So thank you, Amy. Do stay and. Thank you.